October 9, 1980. 20-year-old Michelle Louise Wyatt was found dead in her Santee, California apartment, raped and strangled. Her bright future as a college student cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. For 40 years, her mother Ruth carried the weight of unanswered questions. Who killed her daughter? Why? The police had no suspects, no leads, no hope. Then in 2020, everything changed. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department dusted off Michelle's cold case file. Using cutting-edge genetic genealogy, they uploaded DNA from the crime scene to public databases. The results shocked everyone. The killer wasn't some random stranger who drifted through town. He was John Patrick Hogan, a neighbor, someone who lived just 1 mile from Michelle's apartment, someone who walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, breathed the same air as the grieving family for years after the murder. But here's the twist that will haunt you. Hogan died in 2004, taking his secret to the grave. He lived 17 years knowing he'd destroyed a family while pretending to be just another face in the crowd. How many times did he see Ruth Wyatt at the grocery store, knowing what he'd done to her daughter? The truth was devastating. Michelle's killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, living among them, walking free while a mother's heart broke a little more each day. Ruth spent decades wondering if her daughter's murderer was still out there, still breathing, still living the life he stole from Michelle. She was right to wonder. He was closer than she ever imagined. The case that haunted Santee for 4 decades finally had an answer. But was it the closure Ruth had prayed for, or just another kind of torment? When the monster lives next door, how do you ever feel safe again? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Ruth Wyatt's hands trembled as she held the phone to her ear that October evening in 1980. The kitchen clock showed 7:30 p.m., and her daughter Michelle still hadn't called. Michelle was 20 years old, a responsible college student who never forgot to check in with her parents. She called every evening at 7 sharp, just like clockwork, her cheerful voice filling the silence of their empty nest in Santee, California. David, Ruth whispered to her husband, who was reading his evening paper in their modest living room. The house felt too quiet, too still. Something was wrong. After 25 years of marriage and 2 decades of motherhood, Ruth had learned to trust the cold knot that was forming in her stomach. David Wyatt looked up from his newspaper, concern immediately flickering across his weathered face. At 52, he'd learned to trust his wife's instincts completely. Ruth knew their daughter better than anyone in the world. If she said something was wrong, something was wrong. Maybe she's studying late at the library, David suggested. But even as he spoke the words, his voice lacked conviction. Michelle was responsible, reliable. She'd been that way since she was a little girl, always letting them know where she was, always keeping her promises. She'd never missed a phone call home without warning them first. Ruth shook her head, pacing back and forth by the kitchen window that overlooked their quiet suburban neighborhood. The streetlights were just flickering on, casting long shadows across the tree-lined streets they'd called home for 15 years. When they'd moved to Santee, it had felt like the perfect place to raise a family. Safe, peaceful. A place where their children could grow up without fear, where college kids like Michelle could focus on their studies and their bright futures. Now, as Ruth stared out into the gathering darkness, that sense of safety felt fragile, illusory. "I'm calling her apartment," Ruth said, her fingers shaking as she dialed the familiar number. She'd memorized it the day. Michelle moved into her own place near the college campus, one of those small freedoms that marked the transition from teenager to young adult. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Ruth's heart began to pound harder with each unanswered ring. On the 4th ring, someone picked up, but it wasn't Michelle's voice that came through the receiver. It was a man's voice. Deep, serious. A stranger's voice in her daughter's apartment. "Ma'am, this is Detective Martinez with the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. Are you related to Michelle Wyatt?" The words hit Ruth like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and sending shockwaves through her entire body. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the kitchen counter with her free hand to keep from falling. Behind her, she heard David's newspaper rustle as he stood up, alarm written across his features as he took in his wife's sudden pallor. "I'm her mother," Ruth managed to whisper, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "What's happened? Where's Michelle? Is she hurt? Is she in the hospital?" Even as she asked the questions, part of Ruth already knew the answers would be worse than anything she could imagine. Police don't answer your daughter's phone to deliver good news. They don't call you ma'am in that careful, practiced tone unless they're about to shatter your world. "Ma'am, I need you and your husband to come to your daughter's apartment right away. There's been an incident." An incident, such a small bureaucratic word for something that would divide Ruth's life into 2 distinct halves, before this phone call and after. Before, when her biggest worry was whether Michelle was eating enough vegetables in her dorm cafeteria. After, when she would learn that evil could wear ordinary faces and live in ordinary places, hiding in plain sight while it planned unspeakable acts. The drive to Michelle's apartment complex felt like traveling through a nightmare. Ruth sat in the passenger seat of their Ford sedan, watching familiar streets blur past through tear-filled eyes. David drove in grim silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke during the 15-minute journey, but the silence was filled with unspoken fears, half-formed prayers, and the terrible certainty that their lives were about to change forever. When they turned the corner onto Michelle's street, Ruth's worst fears crystallized into stark reality. Police cars lined the narrow residential street, their red and blue lights painting the darkness in harsh, unforgiving colors that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Ruth's terrified heartbeat. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze like macabre party streamers, cordoning off areas that had been safe just hours before. Ruth could see neighbors standing on their porches and gathered in small clusters on sidewalks, whispering behind their hands and staring at the commotion with the kind of morbid curiosity that tragedy always attracts. Some she recognized: Mrs. Henderson from the corner house, the young couple with the new baby who lived 3 doors down from Michelle's building. Others were strangers, drawn out of their homes by the lights and sirens and the undeniable pull of disaster. Detective Martinez met them at the entrance to Michelle's apartment complex. He was a kind-faced man in his early 40s with graying temples and tired eyes, the kind of experienced officer who'd probably delivered this type of devastating news too many times before. His presence carried the weight of experience that Ruth desperately wished he didn't have to bear. "Mr. and Mrs. Wyatt," he said gently, his voice carefully modulated with the practiced compassion of someone who'd learned how to break hearts professionally. "I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but your daughter Michelle was found dead in her apartment this evening." The world stopped spinning. Time itself seemed to freeze as those words, "found dead," echoed in Ruth's ears like a bell tolling the end of everything she'd believed about safety, about justice, about the fundamental order of the universe. She felt David's strong arm wrap around her waist as her legs gave out completely, her body refusing to support the weight of this new reality. Dead. Michelle was dead. Their bright, beautiful 20-year-old daughter with her infectious laugh and her plans to become an elementary school teacher. Their baby girl who still brought her laundry home every Sunday and called every evening without fail. Gone. How? David's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. Every fear that lurks in the dark corners of the mind when you love someone so completely that their safety becomes more important than your own breath. Detective Martinez's jaw tightened, and Ruth saw him steel himself for what came next. In that moment, she realized that whatever he was about to tell them would be even worse than the simple fact of Michelle's death. "She was murdered," he said, each word falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward and touch every aspect of their lives forever. "Raped and strangled. We're treating this as a homicide investigation, and I want you to know that we're going to do everything in our power to find the person responsible for this." Ruth's scream tore through the night air like a living thing, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to rip through the fabric of the evening itself. It was the sound of a mother's heart breaking, of innocence dying, of faith in the basic goodness of the world crumbling to dust. Several neighbors who'd been watching from a distance stepped back, as if her grief might somehow reach out and touch them too, contaminating them with the terrible knowledge that such things could happen to people like them, in places like this. But it was too late for that kind of magical thinking. Michelle's death had already touched everyone in Santee, everyone who would read about it in the local newspaper or hear about it on the evening news. They just didn't know it yet. The investigation began immediately, but it felt like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Detective Martinez and his team of experienced investigators interviewed every neighbor in the apartment complex, knocking on doors and asking the same questions over and over. Had anyone seen anything suspicious? Heard any unusual noises? Noticed strangers in the area? They canvassed the surrounding neighborhood with methodical thoroughness, walking door to door through streets where children played hopscotch and families gathered for barbecues, searching for anyone who might have witnessed something that could lead them to Michelle's killer. They collected evidence from her apartment with painstaking care, hoping that forensic science might provide the answers that witness testimony couldn't deliver. But the answers didn't come. Ruth and David spent hours at the police station, answering question after question until their voices were hoarse with grief and exhaustion. Who were Michelle's friends? What was her daily routine? Did she have any enemies? Any ex-boyfriends who might have harbored resentment? Was she involved in anything that might have put her in danger? The questions felt like accusations, even though Ruth knew intellectually that the detectives were just doing their job, following standard procedure in a homicide investigation. How do you explain to strangers that your daughter was simply good? That Michelle Louise Wyatt was a 20-year-old college student who wanted to spend her life teaching children to read, who volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, who called her parents every single evening because she loved them and wanted them to know she was safe? How do you make them understand that Michelle had never hurt a soul in her life, had never even gotten a speeding ticket, had never done anything more rebellious than stay up past her curfew to finish a term paper? She was planning to come home for dinner this Sunday, Ruth told Detective Martinez, her voice breaking as she spoke. She was going to bring her laundry like she always does, and I was going to make that apple pie she loves so much. She's been asking for it for weeks. The detective wrote it all down in his notebook, but Ruth could see in his eyes that none of it mattered. Michelle's goodness, her plans, her Sunday dinners, her favorite apple pie, none of it would bring her back or help them catch the monster who'd stolen her life. Days passed without answers. The phone calls from Detective Martinez became less frequent, his updates shorter and less hopeful. The forensic evidence was frustratingly minimal. The killer had been careful, had left few traces behind. No witnesses had come forward despite repeated appeals in the local media. The case was stalling before it had really begun, joining the growing stack of unsolved crimes that haunted law enforcement agencies across the country. Ruth found herself driving past Michelle's apartment complex at all hours of the day and night, as if proximity to the scene of the crime might somehow bring her daughter back or reveal the identity of her killer. She studied the faces of strangers on the street, wondering if one of them might be the monster who'd destroyed her family. Every man she saw became a potential suspect in her mind. Every shadow held the possibility of evil lurking just out of sight. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. Ruth's imagination filled the void left by the lack of concrete information, conjuring scenarios that were somehow both better and worse than reality. Sometimes, she imagined that Michelle's death had been quick and painless, that she hadn't suffered. Other times, the darkness in her mind painted pictures so terrible that she would find herself doubled over with grief and rage, screaming into her pillow at 3 a.m. while David held her and whispered helpless words of comfort. The community of Santee rallied around the Wyatt family in those first traumatic weeks, demonstrating the kind of neighborly support that small towns are famous for. Neighbors appeared at their door with casseroles and condolences, understanding instinctively that grief makes simple tasks like cooking and cleaning feel impossible. The local newspaper ran multiple stories about Michelle's murder, appealing to anyone with information to come forward and do their civic duty. A small reward fund was established by Michelle's college friends and local business owners, people who'd never met her but were moved by the senseless tragedy of her death. The fund grew slowly but steadily as word spread through the community. $20 from the owner of the corner grocery store, $50 from Michelle's former high school math teacher, $100 from a church congregation that had never even heard her name. But as the weeks stretched into months, the phone calls stopped coming. The casserole dishes were quietly returned, washed and empty. The newspaper moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other calls for justice. Life in Santee continued its normal rhythm while Ruth remained frozen in the moment she'd received that terrible phone call, trapped in a bubble of grief that seemed to separate her from the rest of the world. Michelle's funeral had been a blur of flowers and tears, college friends mixing with family members and neighbors in a gathering that felt both too large and too small for the magnitude of the loss. Ruth remembered very little of the service itself, fragments of hymns, the weight of David's hand in hers, the overwhelming smell of lilies that would forever remind her of death. What she remembered most clearly was the weight of the small gold necklace she'd taken from Michelle's jewelry box the night before the funeral. It was a simple piece, nothing expensive or elaborate, N9, just a delicate gold chain with a tiny heart pendant that Michelle had saved up to buy for herself on her 18th birthday. She'd been so proud of that necklace, wearing it everywhere, touching it absently when she was nervous or excited about something. Now it hung around Ruth's neck like a talisman, a physical connection to the daughter she would never see again. The metal was warm against her skin, heated by her body, and sometimes Ruth found herself touching it without conscious thought, as if Michelle's spirit might somehow flow through the gold and into her broken heart. The necklace became her most precious possession, the one material thing that connected her to Michelle's dreams and aspirations. It was all she had left of her daughter's bright future, of the woman Michelle had been becoming before her life was brutally cut short. David tried to be strong for both of them, but Ruth could see the investigation's failure eating away at him too. He'd always been a man who believed deeply in justice, in the system, in the fundamental idea that good would ultimately prevail over evil if people just worked hard enough and played by the rules. He'd served briefly in Vietnam, had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other, but he'd come home believing that America was different, that civilization meant something, that monsters could be caught and punished. Michelle's murder shattered that faith in ways he couldn't articulate, couldn't even admit to himself. How do you maintain belief in justice when your daughter's killer walks free? How do you trust in a system that seems powerless to protect the innocent or punish the guilty? Maybe we should hire a private investigator, he suggested one evening as they sat in their living room, the television playing but neither of them really watching. It was 3 months after Michelle's death, and the official investigation had ground to a virtual halt. Ruth looked up from the blued photo album she'd been studying, the same one she looked through every night, searching Michelle's smiling face for some clue they might have missed, some hint of danger that had been lurking in her daughter's world. The pictures showed a young woman full of life and hope. Michelle at her high school graduation, Michelle on her first day of college, Michelle laughing with friends at a beach bonfire. With what money? Ruth asked quietly. David's job at the electronics company paid their bills and provided decent health insurance, but there wasn't much left over for luxuries like private investigators. And even if there had been money for such things, Ruth wasn't sure it would help. If the police couldn't find Michelle's killer with all their resources and training and access to forensic laboratories, what hope did a private investigator have? The months crawled by with agonizing slowness, each one taking them further from Michelle's life and deeper into a future she would never see. 1981 became 1982, then 1983. Detective Martinez was transferred to another unit, a victim of budget cuts and departmental restructuring. New detectives took over Michelle's case, but Ruth could see in their faces that they were just going through the motions, checking boxes and filing reports without any real hope of solving a crime that was growing colder by the day. Michelle's file joined the growing stack of cold cases that haunted the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, gathering dust in filing cabinets alongside dozens of other unsolved murders and missing persons cases. Each file represented a family like theirs, people who went to bed every night wondering if tomorrow would bring the phone call they'd been waiting for, the knock on the door that would finally provide answers. Ruth aged visibly during those years of waiting. The grief carved deep lines into her face and stole the color from her hair, transforming her from a vibrant woman in her late 40s into someone who looked decades older. She still wore Michelle's necklace every day, still looked at her daughter's photographs every night, still jumped every time the phone rang, hoping against hope that it might finally be news. But the news never came. By the mid-1980s, DNA testing was beginning to emerge as a revolutionary tool in criminal investigations. Ruth read about it in the newspaper, watched stories about it on the evening news, and felt the first flicker of hope she'd experienced in years. Science had always moved forward, always found new ways to answer old questions. Maybe this new technology could provide the breakthrough that traditional detective work hadn't been able to deliver. She called the sheriff's department and spoke to the newest detective assigned to Michelle's case, a young man named Detective Roberts, who sounded like he was barely older than Michelle had been when she died. His voice carried the enthusiasm of youth, but also the weight of inheriting cases that more experienced officers had been unable to solve. "Mrs. Wyatt," he said patiently, and Ruth could hear him flipping through papers on his desk, probably looking at Michelle's file for the first time. "We've looked into the DNA testing option. The problem is that the evidence from your daughter's case is minimal. What we have might not be enough for a definitive match, even if we found a suspect to compare it to." Ruth's heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. "So you're saying there's no hope?" "I'm saying we're not giving up," Detective Roberts replied, but his voice lacked the conviction that might have made his words comforting. Ruth had heard that tone before from other detectives over the years. It was the sound of someone trying to be kind while delivering news that offered no real hope. The 1990s brought new detectives and new disappointments, a rotating cast of well-meaning law enforcement officials who inherited Michelle's case, along with dozens of others just like it. Ruth watched from the sidelines as other cold cases were solved. Other families received the closure she craved. DNA technology was advancing rapidly, helping to solve crimes that had been considered unsolvable just a few years earlier. She attended victim advocacy meetings when she could bear it, joined support groups filled with other parents who understood the particular agony of not knowing. She wrote letters to politicians about the need for better funding for cold case investigations, testified before county commissioners about the importance of never giving up on unsolved crimes. But Michelle's case remained stubbornly unsolved. Ruth's faith, once as solid and unshakable as bedrock, began to waver like a candle flame in a strong wind. She still went to church every Sunday, still sat in the same pews she and David had occupied for 20 years, still bowed her head when the pastor called for prayer. But the prayers felt hollow now, empty words echoing in the vast space where her certainty used to live. How do you maintain belief in divine justice when your daughter's killer walks free while you grow old waiting for answers? How do you trust in God's plan when that plan seems to include the brutal murder of innocent young women who never hurt anyone? David worried about her constantly. She could see it in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful way he chose his words when Michelle's name came up in conversation. He'd learned to carry his grief quietly, to function in the world despite the gaping hole that Michelle's death had torn in his heart. But Ruth wore her pain like a second skin, unable to hide it or set it aside even for a few hours. "You need to try to move on," he said one evening in 1998, 18 years after Michelle's murder. They were sitting in their living room again, the same room where Ruth had first felt the cold grip of terror, when Detective Martinez called. The house felt different now, heavier somehow, as if grief had settled into the walls and furniture like dust. Ruth looked down at the gold necklace she still wore, Michelle's necklace that had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. "How do you move on when you don't know who did this to her? He's still out there, David. Still breathing, still living, maybe hurting other people. How do I move on knowing that?" David didn't have an answer, because there wasn't one. How do you build a future when the past holds so many unanswered questions? How do you find peace when justice feels like an impossible dream? The year 2000 came and went with its Y2K fears that proved unfounded, its promises of technological revolution and global connectivity. The world moved forward into a new millennium while Ruth remained trapped in 1980, reliving that terrible phone call, that awful night when her life had been divided forever into before and after. She was 68 years old now, a grandmother to David Jr.'s 3 children, a woman who should have been enjoying her retirement and watching her daughter raise children of her own. Instead, she was still waiting for justice that might never come, still carrying the weight of unanswered questions that grew heavier with each passing year. Ruth had watched her granddaughter Sarah grow from a toddler into a young woman who was now older than Michelle had been when she died. The realization hit her like a physical blow one day when Sarah graduated from high school. Michelle would never attend her own children's graduations, would never experience the pride and joy of watching the next generation take its first steps into adulthood. Then, on a cold morning in February 2020, Detective Sarah Chen called with words that Ruth had been waiting 40 years to hear. Ruth almost didn't answer the phone when she saw the sheriff's department number on her caller ID. After 4 decades of disappointments, she'd learned to be wary of calls from law enforcement. They usually meant another detective was being transferred, another lead had gone nowhere, another dead end in the endless maze of Michelle's case. But something in Detective Chen's voice was different from the very first word. She sounded excited, energized, hopeful. Ruth hadn't heard genuine hope in a detective's voice in more years than she could count. "Mrs. Wyatt, I know you've heard promises like this before, but I think we might finally have a real breakthrough in Michelle's case. There's a new technique called investigative genetic genealogy that's been used to solve several high-profile cold cases recently. We'd like to try it with the DNA evidence from your daughter's murder." Ruth gripped the phone with both hands, hardly daring to breathe. At 88 years old, she'd learned not to get her hopes up too high, but she couldn't help the flutter of excitement that rose in her chest. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we upload the killer's DNA profile to public genealogical databases, sites like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, and look for familial matches, people who might be related to the perpetrator. Then we work backward through family trees to identify potential suspects." It sounded like science fiction to Ruth, but she'd lived long enough to see the impossible become routine. She'd watched humans walk on the moon, seen computers shrink from room-sized machines to devices that fit in your pocket, witnessed the birth of the internet and the transformation of human communication. "How long would it take?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no way to know for sure," Detective Chen admitted. "It could be weeks, months, or it might not work at all. But Mrs. Wyatt, I've been a detective for 15 years, and I've never seen a technique with this much promise for solving old cases. We've already had success with several other cold cases using this method." For the first time in decades, Ruth felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Real, genuine hope that wasn't just wishful thinking or desperate fantasy, but hope based on scientific advancement and proven results. The process took months of painstaking work. Detective Chen called periodically, with updates that were usually technical and difficult for Ruth to understand completely. The DNA had been uploaded to multiple databases. Potential matches were being analyzed. Family trees were being constructed and researched. It was meticulous work that required both cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned detective work, combining computer algorithms with human intuition and persistence. Ruth tried not to get her hopes up too high, but it was impossible after so many years of waiting. The possibility of finally learning the truth felt almost too precious to bear, like holding a soap bubble that might burst at any moment. Then, in late November 2020, Detective Chen called with news that would change everything Ruth thought she knew about her daughter's murder. "Mrs. Wyatt, we have a match." Ruth's hands began to shake just like they had that terrible night in 1980, 40 years earlier. "What kind of match?" "We've identified the man who killed Michelle. His name was John Patrick Hogan, but he went by Pat. Mrs. Wyatt, he lived in the same apartment complex as your daughter at the time of her murder." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending shockwaves through her entire body. The same apartment complex. He'd been right there, living among them, probably walking past Michelle's apartment every day, while she and David grieved and searched for answers and wondered if they'd ever know the truth. He'd probably seen them during those awful first weeks after Michelle's death, watched them cry and wonder and pray for justice. He might have even spoken to them, offered condolences, pretended to care about finding Michelle's killer while knowing all along that he was the monster they were looking for. "Was?" Ruth managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "You said his name was Pat Hogan." Detective Chen's voice grew gentle, the way it does when someone is about to deliver news that's both good and terrible at the same time. "He died in 2004, Mrs. Wyatt. Natural causes. He can't be prosecuted for what he did to Michelle, but we know who he was now. The case is solved." Ruth didn't know whether to laugh or cry or scream. After 40 years of waiting for justice, the man who'd destroyed her life had been dead for 16 years. He'd never faced trial, never been punished, never had to look her in the eye and explain why he'd killed her innocent daughter. But they knew. Finally, after 4 decades of questions, they knew. Over the following weeks, Detective Chen shared what the investigation had revealed about John Patrick Hogan's life. He'd been a former U.S. Air Force serviceman, a quiet man who kept to himself and seemed unremarkable to those who knew him. Neighbors from the apartment complex remembered him vaguely, the kind of person you might nod to in the hallway but never really notice, never think about once he was out of sight. He'd moved away from Santee not long after Michelle's murder, drifting from state to state, job to job, never staying in one place for very long. He'd never married, never had children, never seemed to put down roots anywhere. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, his restless lifestyle made perfect sense. He'd been running from what he'd done, carrying the secret of Michelle's murder wherever he went, like a cancer, eating away at whatever remained of his conscience. Ruth found herself obsessing over the details of Hogan's life after Michelle's death, trying to piece together a picture of the man who'd destroyed her family. Where had he worked during those 24 years between the murder and his death? What had he done with himself? Had he ever felt guilty about what he'd done? Had he ever thought about the family he'd shattered, the parents who would never recover from their loss? Most importantly, had he ever killed again? "We're looking into that," Detective Chen assured her when Ruth asked the question that kept her awake at night. "We're checking unsolved cases in all the places Hogan lived after leaving Santee. So far, we haven't found any connections, but the investigation is ongoing." The idea that Michelle might not have been Hogan's only victim was almost too horrible to contemplate, but Ruth needed to know. If her daughter's death could somehow help solve other cases, bring closure to other families who'd been waiting for answers just as long as she had, then maybe some good could come from this decades-long nightmare. The case was officially closed in February 2021, exactly 41 years after Michelle's murder. Ruth and David attended a small ceremony at the sheriff's department, where Detective Chen presented them with the final case file and thanked them for their patience during the 4-decade investigation. "Your daughter's case was one of the most challenging I've ever worked on," Detective Chen said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "But it was also one of the most important. Michelle deserved justice, even if it took 41 years to achieve it." Ruth held the thick case file in her lap, feeling its substantial weight. Inside were crime scene photographs she'd never seen, witness statements she'd never read, forensic reports that contained the clinical, scientific details of her daughter's final moments. She wasn't sure she'd ever have the courage to look at it all, but having it felt important somehow, tangible proof that Michelle's life and death had mattered, that people had worked tirelessly to find the truth. After the ceremony, 1980, Ruth and David drove to the cemetery where Michelle was buried, making the familiar journey for the first time since learning Hogan's identity. The headstone was weathered now, the inscription barely visible after 4 decades of California sun and winter rain. Michelle Louise Wyatt, beloved daughter, 1960-1980. Ruth knelt beside the grave and placed her weathered hand on the sun-warmed stone, feeling its rough texture under her palm. The cemetery was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the whisper of wind through the oak trees that provided shade on hot summer days. "We found him, baby," she whispered to the headstone, her voice barely audible even to herself. "We finally found the man who hurt you. His name was Pat Hogan, and he can't hurt anyone else now." For the first time in 41 years, Ruth felt something that might have been peace settling over her like a warm blanket. It wasn't the peace she dreamed of during all those years of waiting, the peace that would have come from seeing Michelle's killer brought to trial, convicted and punished for his crimes. But it was peace nonetheless, the peace that comes from finally knowing the truth after decades of questions. But even as that peace settled over her, Ruth discovered that knowing brought its own complicated form of torment. The peace was tainted by new questions, new images that her mind conjured in the dark hours before dawn. How had Hogan chosen Michelle? What had drawn him to their apartment complex, to their family's orbit? Had it been random chance, or had he been watching Michelle for some time before he struck? The randomness of it was almost worse than the idea of a planned, targeted attack. If Hogan had chosen Michelle specifically, stalked her and planned her murder with deliberate intent, at least there would have been some twisted logic to it. Some reason Ruth could try to understand, even if she could never accept it. But the possibility that her daughter had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, if you know deck to vases, that any young woman living in Dockization, that apartment complex could have been his victim, made the whole thing feel even more senseless, more cruel, more fundamentally unfair. Ruth found herself driving past the old apartment complex where Michelle had lived and died, where Hogan had been her neighbor and probably her killer. The buildings looked different now, older and more run down than she remembered. The complex had changed hands several times over the decades, and new families lived there now. People who had no idea that 41 years ago, a monster had walked among them. Hiding behind an ordinary face and an unremarkable manner, she wondered about the specific details that would forever remain unknown. Which apartment had been Hogan's? Had he been able to hear Michelle's music through the thin walls that separated their living spaces? Had he passed her in the parking lot, maybe even spoken to her in the mailroom or the laundry facility? Had Michelle smiled at him the way she smiled at everyone? Open, friendly, trusting? Had she held the door for him when his hands were full of groceries? Had she wished him good morning on the day he killed her, never knowing she was looking into the eyes of her own death? The not knowing was a different kind of torment than the not knowing Ruth had lived with for 40 years. At least during those decades of uncertainty, she could imagine that Michelle's killer was some stranger who drifted through town, committed his terrible crime, and disappeared forever. The reality was somehow worse. Hogan had been part of their community, breathing the same air, shopping at the same stores, living his life while hers fell apart piece by piece. David handled the revelation differently than Ruth did. For him, knowing seemed to bring genuine relief, a sense of completion that had been missing from their lives for over 4 decades. He'd always been a practical man, someone who needed concrete answers to concrete problems. The identity of Michelle's killer was the most concrete answer they were ever going to get. "At least we know now," he said one evening as they sat in their living room, the same room where they'd first learned of Michelle's death all those years ago. "At least we're not wondering anymore." Ruth nodded, but she wasn't entirely sure that knowing was better than wondering. The wondering had been painful, but it had also carried hope. Hope that someday the truth would emerge, that justice would be served, that the scales would be balanced. Now there was only the stark reality of what had happened, and the knowledge that true justice would never be possible. The community of Santee reacted to the news with a mixture of relief and unease that perfectly captured the complicated emotions surrounding the case's resolution. Relief that the mystery was finally solved, that they finally knew who had been responsible for the crime that had haunted their town for over 4 decades. But unease at the revelation that the killer had been one of their own, that he'd lived among them for months after the murder, probably interacting with the same people who were searching for it. Local news stations covered the story extensively, interviewing neighbors who remembered both Michelle and Hogan from those days in 1980. Their recollections painted a picture of a man who'd been almost aggressively ordinary, someone who'd managed to blend into the background of daily life so completely that he'd become essentially invisible. "He seemed so normal," one elderly neighbor told a television reporter, shaking her head with the bewilderment of someone trying to reconcile 2 incompatible pieces of information. Just a quiet guy who kept to himself. You'd never think he was capable of something like that, but that was exactly what had made him so dangerous, Ruth realized as she watched the news coverage from her living room. Monsters don't announce themselves with fanfare and dramatic music. They don't wear signs identifying them as threats to society. They hide behind ordinary faces and ordinary lives, blending into communities until they're ready to strike. The most terrifying predators are the ones who look like everyone else. Ruth began attending victim advocacy meetings again, something she'd stopped doing years earlier when the constant exposure to other people's tragedies had become too much for her already fragile emotional state to bear. But now she had something valuable to offer other families, the hard-won knowledge that cases could be solved even after decades, that science could provide answers that traditional detective work couldn't deliver. She spoke at several conferences over the following months, telling Michelle's story to audiences of law enforcement officials, victim advocates, and family members of other cold case victims. It was emotionally exhausting work, reliving the worst moments of her life for strangers, but Ruth felt compelled to do it. If Michelle's case could inspire other families to keep hoping, keep pushing for answers, keep fighting against the natural tendency to give up when the years stretched on without resolution, then perhaps her daughter's death could serve some greater purpose. "Don't give up," she told these audiences, her voice steady despite the pain that still lived behind her words. "I waited 41 years for answers about my daughter's murder. 41 years. There were times I thought the truth would die with me, that I'd go to my grave never knowing who killed Michelle or why." She would pause then, looking out at the faces in the audience, faces marked by their own grief, their own unanswered questions, their own desperate hope for closure. But science kept advancing, and dedicated investigators kept working, and eventually, the truth came out. It will come out for your loved ones too, if you don't give up. If you keep pushing, keep asking questions, keep demanding that someone care about your case. The speeches were emotionally draining, but they also helped Ruth process her own complicated feelings about the case's resolution. Standing in front of other grieving families, she could see her own journey reflected in their faces, the hope that warred with despair, the determination that battled against exhaustion, the love that refused to accept that some questions would never have answers. Some families had been waiting even longer than Ruth had. She met a woman whose son had been murdered in 1975, a man whose daughter had disappeared in 1968 and had never been found. Their pain was older than Ruth's, their hope more fragile, worn thin by even more years of disappointment. But they were still fighting, still believing that someday, somehow, they would get the answers they needed. Ruth began to understand that Michelle's case wasn't just about Michelle anymore. It was part of a larger story about families who refuse to accept that some questions will never have answers, about the power of persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds, about the advancement of science and technology in service of justice, and about the dedication of investigators who inherit old cases and choose to see them as puzzles to be solved rather than files to be forgotten. Detective Chen became something of a hero to Ruth, a symbol of everything that was right about law enforcement when it worked the way it was supposed to. The young woman had inherited a 40-year-old case that other detectives had essentially given up on, and she'd refused to let it remain unsolved. She'd learned new techniques, pushed for resources, advocated for the use of cutting-edge technology, and ultimately delivered the answers that Ruth had waited half a lifetime to receive. "Why?" Ruth asked her during one of their final meetings at the sheriff's department. "Why did you care so much about an old case that wasn't even originally yours? You could have focused on newer cases, crimes with fresher evidence and better chances of prosecution." Detective Chen was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. "Because Michelle deserved justice," she finally said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "And because you deserved answers." It was that simple. But Ruth knew it wasn't simple at all. Detective Chen could have treated Michelle's file as just another cold case, taking up space in a filing cabinet, another unsolved crime in a system overwhelmed by violence and tragedy. Instead, she'd chosen to see Michelle as a person, rather than a statistic, a young woman whose life had been stolen and whose family had been left to grieve without closure for over 4 decades. That choice, to see the human cost behind the bureaucratic file, had made all the difference in the world. In March 2023, Ruth made a decision she'd been avoiding for months. She drove to the cemetery where Michelle was buried and sat beside her daughter's grave with Pat Hogan's photograph in her hands, a driver's license photo that Detective Chen had obtained from the California department of motor vehicles. For 43 years, Ruth had wondered what Michelle's killer looked like. She'd constructed countless mental images based on her fears and nightmares. Sometimes he was a hulking brute with dead eyes, sometimes a smooth-talking predator who could charm his way into a young woman's trust. In her darkest moments, she'd imagined him as a faceless shadow, evil incarnate stalking through her daughter's world. Now, she knew the truth. He'd been an ordinary-looking man with thinning brown hair and tired eyes, someone you might pass on the street without giving a second thought. He looked like anyone's father, anyone's neighbor, anyone's co-worker. He looked like everyone and no one, unremarkable in every way except for the terrible secret he'd carried. "This is him, baby," Ruth whispered to Michelle's headstone, her voice barely audible in the quiet cemetery. "This is the man who hurt you." She studied Hogan's face in the photograph, searching for some sign of the evil he'd carried inside, some visible indication of his capacity for violence. But there was nothing, just the mundane features of a middle-aged man who could have been selling insurance or fixing cars or teaching schoolchildren. The banality of his appearance was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. Ruth folded the photograph carefully and put it away in her purse. She would never look at it again. She'd needed to see it once, to put a face to the monster that had haunted her nightmares for 4 decades. But now that she had, she realized it changed nothing fundamental about her situation. Hogan was dead. Michelle was still gone. And all the photographs in the world couldn't bring her daughter back or undo the decades of pain his actions had caused. What mattered was that the truth was finally known. Michelle's story was complete now, the final chapter written after 43 years of uncertainty. The questions that had tormented Ruth for nearly half a century finally had answers, even if those answers weren't the ones she'd hoped and prayed for during all those sleepless nights. Standing up slowly from beside Michelle's grave, her knees weren't what they used to be at 89. Ruth touched the gold necklace she still wore every day. Michelle's necklace, which had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat over the decades. For 43 years, the necklace had been a symbol of loss, a reminder of all the conversations they'd never have, all the milestones Michelle would never reach, all the grandchildren Ruth would never hold. It had been a weight around her neck, beautiful but painful, connecting her to grief that sometimes threatened to drown her. But standing there in the afternoon sunshine, surrounded by the peaceful quiet of the cemetery, Ruth began to think of the necklace differently. It was also a symbol of love that had endured beyond death, of memory that remained vivid despite the passage of time, of the way people live on in the hearts of those who knew them best. Michelle was gone, but she wasn't forgotten. Her story had been told completely now, her killer identified, her family's long wait for justice finally over. The case files would be archived, the investigation officially closed, but Michelle's impact on the world would continue as long as people remembered her story. Ruth walked slowly back to her car, pausing once to look over her shoulder at Michelle's headstone. The late afternoon light caught the weathered marble, making the carved letters seem to glow for just a moment. Michelle Louise Wyatt, beloved daughter, 1960-1980. Those simple words didn't tell the whole story, of course. They couldn't capture Michelle's infectious laugh or her dreams of becoming a teacher. They couldn't convey the way she'd made everyone around her feel special, or her habit of calling home every evening just to check in with her parents. But they didn't need to tell the whole story. That story lived on in the memories of everyone who'd known and loved Michelle, in the testimony of friends who still spoke her name with affection, in the legacy of a case that had ultimately been solved through the persistence of people who refused to let her be forgotten. Ruth drove home through the familiar streets of Santee, past the shopping centers and schools and churches that had formed the backdrop of their family's life. The town had changed dramatically over the decades. New housing developments, where there had once been orange groves, strip malls where family farms used to stand, traffic lights, where stop signs had been sufficient for the slower pace of small-town life. But some things remained constant. The mountains still rose in the distance, purple and gold in the setting Sunday. The air still carried the scent of eucalyptus trees and blooming jasmine. Children still played in front yards while their parents watched from porches, trusting in the basic safety of their community. That trust had been shattered on October 9, 1980, when evil had revealed itself in their midst. But it had been slowly rebuilt over the years, strengthened by the knowledge that good people, detectives like Sarah Chen, advocates like Ruth herself, scientists working in laboratories around the country, were committed to ensuring that justice would eventually prevail. At home, Ruth found David waiting for her in their living room, the same room where they'd received that terrible phone call 43 years earlier. He looked up from his book as she entered, and she could see the question in his eyes before he spoke it. "How was it?" he asked gently. "It was time," Ruth replied. settling into her favorite chair across from him. I needed to see his face, and now I have. I needed to tell Michelle that we found him, and now I've done that too. David nodded, understanding passing between them without the need for more words. After 55 years of marriage and 4 decades of shared grief, they'd learned to communicate in gestures and glances, in the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd weathered life's worst storms together. That evening, as they sat together watching the news, a story came on about another cold case that had been solved using genetic genealogy. A young man in Oregon whose murder had gone unsolved for 25 years, a family finally getting answers after a quarter-century of wondering. Ruth felt a complex mix of emotions as she watched the news report: joy for the family that was finally getting closure, sadness for the years they'd lost to uncertainty, and a deep satisfaction that the technique that had solved Michelle's case was helping other families as well. 25 years, David said quietly. They only had to wait 25 years. Ruth squeezed his hand. Every family's timeline is different. What matters is that they got their answers, eventually, just like we did. Over the following months, Ruth threw herself into victim advocacy work with a passion she hadn't felt in years. She testified before state legislative committees about the importance of funding cold case investigations, spoke at law enforcement conferences about the impact of unsolved crimes on families, and worked with other victim advocates to raise awareness about the potential of genetic genealogy to solve decades-old cases. The work was demanding for someone her age, but it gave Ruth a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since Michelle's death. For 43 years, she'd been defined primarily by her loss, by the questions that had no answers, by the grief that had shaped every aspect of her existence. Now she could be defined by something more positive, by her advocacy for other families, by her determination to ensure that the lessons learned from Michelle's case would benefit others, by her commitment to making sure that no parent would have to wait 43 years for answers about their child's murder. She received letters from families across the country, people who'd heard her speak or read about her story in the media. Some were recent victims, still raw with fresh grief and desperate for any sign of hope. Others were longtime waiters like herself, people who'd been carrying their questions for decades and needed reassurance that they shouldn't give up. Ruth answered every letter personally, her handwriting shaky now, but her words strong and encouraging. She shared what she'd learned about persistence, about hope, about the importance of never letting the system forget about your loved one's case. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, she wrote to one mother whose daughter had been murdered 15 years earlier. Keep calling, keep writing, keep making sure someone remembers your daughter's name. Science is advancing every day, and cases that seem impossible today might be solvable tomorrow. In the summer of 2023, Ruth was invited to speak at a national conference of cold case investigators in Washington, D.C. It was a prestigious event, bringing together the country's leading experts in solving decades-old crimes, and Ruth was both honored and terrified to be included on the program. The auditorium was filled with detectives, FBI agents, prosecutors, and victim advocates from across the United States. Ruth stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and felt the weight of responsibility that came with representing not just Michelle's case, but all the families still waiting for answers. 43 years, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the large space. That's how long my family waited for justice for our daughter Michelle. 43 years of wondering, of hoping, or of sometimes despairing that we'd ever know the truth. She told Michelle's story with the practiced ease of someone who'd shared it many times, but the emotion behind her words was as fresh as ever. She spoke about the importance of never giving up, about the power of advancing technology, about the dedication of investigators who refused to let old cases gather dust. My daughter's killer lived 1 mile from her apartment, Ruth said, her voice growing stronger as she reached the heart of her message. He walked the same streets we walked, shopped at the same stores, breathed the same air. For years after Michelle's murder, he probably saw us around town, saw us grieving, saw us aging, saw us carrying the weight of not knowing. The auditorium was completely silent, hundreds of seasoned investigators hanging on every word. But here's what I want you to remember, Ruth continued. Evil may hide in plain sight, but truth has a way of emerging eventually. Science keeps advancing, technology keeps improving, and dedicated people like yourselves keep working. Justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. The standing ovation that followed was thunderous, filled with the kind of respect and admiration that comes from professionals recognizing someone who'd endured the unendurable and emerged with wisdom to share. After her speech, Ruth was approached by dozens of investigators who wanted to thank her personally, to tell her about cases they were working on, to share their own stories of families who'd waited years or decades for answers. Detective Chen was there, of course, beaming with pride as colleagues congratulated her on the Michelle Wyatt case. She'd been promoted since solving the case, recognized as a leader in the use of genetic genealogy for cold case investigations. "Mrs. Wyatt," she said as they stood together after the conference, "I want you to know that Michelle's case changed my entire approach to this work. Every cold case file I pick up now, I think about the family behind it. I think about the mother who's waiting for answers, who's been waiting maybe for decades." Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes. Michelle would be so proud to know that her case helped other families. "That was always my hope, that some good could come from all this pain." On the flight home to California, Ruth reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible phone call in 1980. She'd started as a grieving mother with no experience in advocacy or criminal justice, someone who'd never imagined she'd be speaking to audiences of law enforcement professionals or testifying before legislative committees. The journey had transformed her from a victim into an advocate, from someone defined by loss into someone defined by purpose. It hadn't erased the pain of Michelle's death. Nothing could do that, but it had given meaning to the decades of waiting and wondering. As the plane descended toward San Diego, Ruth looked out the window at the sprawling urban landscape below. Somewhere down there was the apartment complex where Michelle had lived and died, where Pat Hogan had hidden his terrible secret for months before fleeing to spend the rest of his life running from what he'd done. Somewhere down there was the cemetery where Michelle rested, her grave marked by a simple stone that told only the barest facts of her short life. Somewhere down there were the police stations and courtrooms and crime laboratories where dedicated professionals worked every day to ensure that families like hers eventually got the answers they deserved. Ruth touched Michelle's necklace one more time, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. Tomorrow she would continue her advocacy work, writing letters and making phone calls, and doing whatever she could to help other families avoid the 43-year wait she'd endured. But tonight, for the first time in decades, she would sleep peacefully, knowing that Michelle's story was complete, that justice had finally been served in the only way it could be, and that her daughter's legacy would live on in every cold case that was solved, every family that was reunited with the truth, every mother who wouldn't have to spend her entire life wondering what happened to her child. The plane touched down smoothly, and Ruth gathered her things, ready to return to the life she'd built from the ashes of her greatest loss. She was 89 years old, a widow now. David had passed away peacefully in his sleep the previous winter, but she wasn't done yet. There were still families waiting for answers, still cases waiting to be solved, still stories waiting to be told. Michelle's case had taken 43 years to resolve, but it had ultimately been worth the wait. Truth had a way of emerging eventually, no matter how long it took, or how well evil thought it could hide. Ruth walked through the airport terminal with the confident stride of someone who'd learned that persistence could overcome almost any obstacle, that love could survive any loss, and that justice, however delayed, was always worth fighting for. Behind her, the setting sun painted the California sky in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and eternal, as the love between a mother and daughter that not even death could destroy. Michelle Louise Wyatt would never be forgotten, and her story would continue to inspire others for as long as there were families waiting for justice and investigators willing to fight for it. The case was closed, but the legacy lived on,